The air itself seemed to hold its breath in the pre-dawn darkness of September 23, 1859, when 4 white men across the plantation were torn from their sleep by agony, so complete, so incomprehensible, that their screams would haunt the Mississippi Delta for generations. In that single savage moment, the truth could no longer hide. Esther wasn't simply ushering life into the world anymore. She had become something far more terrifying. A surgeon of vengeance, methodical and absolute. Under the cover of that Mississippi night, wielding the ancestral Yoruba medical arts and the very obstetric instruments that had delivered dozens of white babies into safe, privileged lives, she performed an operation no medical textbook had ever described. Colonel Thornhill, his firstborn Edmund, the brutal overseer, Samuel McKinney, and the plantation physician, Dr. Silas Peaton, one by one, with the unerring precision of a woman who had guided 1,000 infants through the gates of birth, she unmanned them. Completely. Permanently. When the Mississippi sun finally crested the cotton fields, painting the horizon in shades of gold and amber, it illuminated a scene of unspeakable horror. 4 men, once pillars of power, now lay mutilated and bleeding, their bodies experiencing, for the first time in their lives, a fraction of the agony they had dispensed so casually for decades. And Esther, she dissolved into the morning mist like smoke from a dying ember. Never found, never captured, never brought to justice by the laws of men, but she left behind a surgical message, written in flesh and blood, that would terrorize the entire antebellum South. An enslaved woman, armed with ancient knowledge and infinite patience, had proven that she could destroy entire bloodlines of white mastery generation by generation, and no one would suspect until it was far, far too late. Esther's journey to that bloody reckoning began not on that September night, but 17 years earlier, when a 15-year-old Yoruba girl was ripped from the slave coast of Africa. Her mind, carrying millennia of medical secrets, passed down through 50 generations of women. The year was 1842, when the slave ship Mercy, a name that mocked the very hell churning in its fall hold, deposited its wretched human cargo at the port of New Orleans. Among the 217 enslaved Africans who stumbled, blinking and broken, onto American soil that scorching August morning, stood a girl who would one day make 4 powerful white men wish their mothers had never conceived them. Her Yoruba name was Azura. It meant patience rewarded. The slave traders couldn't pronounce it. They didn't care to try. They scrawled Easter on the bill of sale and sold her for $600 to a Kentucky tobacco farmer named Obadiah Rutherford. From the very beginning, Esther was different. While other enslaved girls her age worked the fields with eyes that had learned to see nothing, Esther observed everything with the keen attention of a natural healer. She noted which plants the white doctor gathered for fevers, which roots the elderly enslaved women chewed to ease their pain, which herbs flourished wild in the woods encircling the plantation. In her homeland, she had been the granddaughter of a renowned healer, a woman who attended the births of royalty and guarded knowledge that had survived 50 generations of Yoruba medicine women. Esther's grandmother had begun her education at age 7. The properties of every plant, the sacred geography of the human body, the delicate, dangerous art of bringing new life into the world, without losing the mother to the shadow lands. The Middle Passage had stolen Esther's freedom, her family, her homeland, her name. But it could not steal what lived in her mind. Every remedy, every technique, every secret of life and death remained locked in her memory, patient as a coiled serpent, waiting. For 3 years, Esther kept this knowledge buried while working Rutherford's tobacco fields. She watched. She learned English. She studied the cruel rhythms of plantation life. She endured. At 18, everything changed. A white woman, Rutherford's daughter, Clara, went into a labor that turned monstrous. The local doctor was, as usual, swimming in whiskey, and the baby was breech. Clara was dying, screaming her life out through a river of blood. Panic gripped the household. Esther was in the kitchen when she heard those screams. Something ancient stirred in her blood, something that transcended chains and whips and the color of skin. She walked calmly to the birthing room, pushed past the hysterical white women, and assessed Clara with the professional detachment her grandmother had drilled into her. The white women tried to drag her away. A field slave had no place in the big house during such a sacred moment. But Clara's mother, desperate and terrified, screamed, "Let the girl try! My daughter is dying anyway!" What Esther did next saved 2 lives and altered her own forever. She washed her hands thoroughly, something the white doctor never bothered to do. She examined Clara with gentle, knowing fingers. She identified the crisis immediately, a footling breech presentation with cord prolapse. Using nothing but her hands and 1,500 years of accumulated Yoruba medical wisdom, Esther turned that baby inside the womb. 27 minutes of careful, precise manipulation. When the baby boy finally emerged healthy and screaming, the room fell into a shocked, reverent silence. Clara survived. The baby thrived. And Obadiah Rutherford realized he owned something far more valuable than a field hand. Within a week, Esther's life transformed. She was moved from the slave quarters to a small cabin near the big house. Her field clothes were replaced with clean dresses. Her new role was official plantation midwife. For the next 3 years in Kentucky, Esther attended every difficult birth within 20 miles. White women who wouldn't let a Negro eat at their table trusted Esther with their very lives in their most vulnerable moments. She delivered 23 babies, lost none, and earned Rutherford additional income as neighboring planters paid handsomely for her services. But Esther was still property, still a slave, still subject to the whims of white men who saw her as an object, not a human being. In 1845, Rutherford's gambling debts caught up with him. He sold everything, including Esther, to settle accounts. She was 20 years old when Colonel Augustus Thornhill of Mississippi purchased her for $1,200, double what Rutherford had paid, specifically for her midwifery skills. Thornhill's wife, Constance, had lost 3 babies to incompetent doctors and was desperate for a living heir. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land in Covington County, 30 miles south of Jackson. King Cotton ruled here absolutely. 247 enslaved people worked Thornhill's fields, producing 400 bales annually, each bale worth $75 at market. Augustus Thornhill was one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi, a power in state politics, a respected member of Natchez society. He was also a monster. But Esther didn't know that yet. The plantation itself was a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. The big house rose 3 stories, white columns visible for miles, Greek Revival architecture designed to intimidate and awe. Behind it stretched the cotton fields, endless rows that devoured enslaved bodies during picking season. The slave quarters housed 247 people in 43 cramped cabins. Between the big house and the quarters stood the overseer's house, the cotton gin, the blacksmith shop, the stables, and Esther's new domain, a small medical cabin equipped with basic instruments and supplies. The hierarchy at Thornhill Plantation was brutally clear. Colonel Thornhill ruled absolutely, his word literal law over every person, black or white, on his land. His wife Constance managed the household slaves with iron control and petty cruelties. Their son Edmund, 22 years old in 1845, was being groomed to inherit the empire and had inherited his father's sadism without the intelligence to conceal it. The overseer, Samuel McKinney, was a poor white man from Alabama who compensated for his low birth by brutalizing those beneath him with creative enthusiasm. And Dr. Silas Patton, the plantation physician, was a failed surgeon from Philadelphia who had fled north after too many patients died on his table, finding in Mississippi a place where his experiments on enslaved bodies would never be questioned. Into this world stepped Esther, 20 years old, carrying medical knowledge that made her simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. Her first task was delivering Constance, Thornhill's fourth attempt at an heir. Constance was 38, her body damaged by 3 previous births and losses. The pregnancy was dangerous. Constance knew it. Augustus knew it. Everyone knew it. But in 1845 Mississippi, a white woman's value was measured in sons, and Constance was desperate. Esther attended Constance for 6 months of pregnancy, monitoring her health, preparing herbal tonics to strengthen her blood, teaching her breathing techniques. When labor began on a February night, Esther was ready. The delivery took 19 hours. 3 times, the baby's heartbeat weakened dangerously. Twice, Constance hemorrhaged. But Esther, drawing on her grandmother's teachings and her own growing experience, kept both mother and child alive through sheer skill and determination. Edmund Augustus Thornhill Jr. was born on February 14, 1846, healthy and screaming. Colonel Thornhill, drunk with joy and bourbon, gave Esther a silver dollar, the first money she'd ever held, and promised her special treatment for saving his heir. That special treatment meant Esther was never sold again. It meant she received better food, better clothing, a degree of protection from the overseer's worst brutalities. It meant every pregnant white woman in Covington County and beyond wanted Esther at their bedside. Over the next 13 years, from 1846 to 1859, Esther delivered 43 white babies and lost none. She became a legend in Mississippi society, the miracle midwife that wealthy planters bragged about owning. But it also meant something else, something darker. It meant that Colonel Thornhill, Samuel McKinney, Edmund Thornhill, and Dr. Patton believed Esther was theirs to use however they wished. The first time it happened, Esther was 23 years old. She had been at Thornhill Plantation for 3 years. She had delivered 6 healthy white babies. She had earned trust, respect even from the white women she served. She was in her medical cabin organizing herbs when Colonel Thornhill entered. She knew immediately why he had come. She had seen that look before. In Kentucky, in New Orleans, on the slave ship. The look that saw her not as Esther the skilled healer, but as flesh that belonged to him. She tried to talk. "Master, I have work. You have whatever work I give you, girl." What happened next took 11 minutes. Esther counted every second, a survival technique her grandmother had taught her. When pain comes, count, make time concrete, refuse to disappear into the horror. 660 seconds. When it was over, Colonel Thornhill adjusted his clothing and said, "You're a good girl, Esther. Keep doing your work well, and this doesn't have to happen often." But it did happen often, once a month, sometimes more. And not just Thornhill. His son Edmund started when he turned 25. The overseer McKinney considered it a job benefit. Dr. Patton, who should have known better, who had medical training, who understood exactly what he was doing, was perhaps the worst because he performed his violations with clinical detachment, as if Esther were a cadaver for practice. For 14 years, Esther endured. She had no choice. Resistance meant death, or sail to the deep South sugar plantations where life expectancy was 7 years, or sail to a breeding farm where she would be nothing but a womb. She was trapped. But during those 14 years, Esther learned. She learned every detail of her rapist's bodies. She learned their routines, their vulnerabilities, their fears. She learned which herbs could heal and which could harm. She learned that the same knife that cut an umbilical cord could cut other things. She learned that the same hands that brought life into the world could take life out of it. And she waited. What Esther didn't know was that her waiting had an expiration date, and that date was approaching with the inevitability of a Mississippi thunderstorm. In the slave quarters, Esther had built something precious. A family, not by blood but by choice. There was Mama Ruth, 72 years old, born in slavery, who had delivered babies before Esther was born and taught her the American plants that corresponded to African remedies. There was Samuel, a blacksmith, 40 years old, strong and gentle, who became Esther's husband in a ceremony with no legal standing but infinite spiritual weight. And there was Grace, their daughter, born in 1852 when Esther was 27. Grace was 7 years old in 1859. She was smart, curious, beautiful. She had her mother's healing hands and her father's kind heart. Esther and Samuel protected her fiercely, kept her close, taught her to be invisible to white eyes. In the slave quarters at night, Esther taught Grace the same things her grandmother had taught her. Plant names, anatomy, healing prayers in Yoruba that Grace memorized without understanding but preserved faithfully. Grace was Esther's hope, the reason she endured, the future she was building. On September 1st, 1859, that hope was murdered. It was picking season, the brutal months when every enslaved person over age 7 worked the cotton fields from can see to can't see. 16-hour days under the Mississippi sun. Grace was 7, old enough to pick according to Thornhill's rules. But Esther had kept her close, using her midwifery status to justify keeping Grace as her assistant. Edmund Thornhill, now 36 years old, drunk on his father's bourbon and his own sense of entitlement, had other ideas. Esther was attending a difficult labor at a neighboring plantation 20 miles away. She had been gone for 2 days. Samuel was at the blacksmith shop repairing tools. Grace was alone in Esther's medical cabin, organizing herbs the way her mother had taught her. Edmund found her there. What happened in that cabin took place over the course of 2 hours. The details are too brutal to recount in full, but what matters is this. When Samuel came looking for his daughter at sunset, he found her on the cabin floor. She was conscious, barely. She was bleeding from injuries no 7-year-old child should survive. Samuel carried Grace to Mama Ruth, who did everything she knew to save the child. But Grace's injuries were too severe, her small body too damaged. She lived for 3 more hours, long enough for Esther to return, long enough to whisper, "Mama," one last time, long enough to make Esther watch her die. Grace died at 8:43 in the evening on September 1st, 1859. Esther held her daughter's body until midnight. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Samuel tried to comfort her, but she was somewhere beyond comfort. Mama Ruth tried to pray, but Esther was somewhere beyond prayer. At midnight, Esther gently laid Grace's body down, stood up, and walked outside. She looked at the big house lit with lanterns, where Edmund Thornhill was probably already drunk and asleep. She looked at the overseer's house where McKinney lived. She looked at the small house where Dr. Peton resided. She looked at the master bedroom where Colonel Thornhill slept beside his wife. In that moment, something broke inside Esther. Or perhaps something was finally, completely born. She walked back into the medical cabin. She looked at her instruments, the scalpels, the forceps, the surgical needles, the bone saw. Tools of life. Tools of death. The difference was merely intention. She sat down at her small desk and began to plan. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This was real. These horrors happened on American soil, sanctioned by law, protected by society. Grace was one of thousands of enslaved children violated and murdered, most without names remembered, without stories told. Esther's story survives because of what came next. But for every Esther who fought back, there were countless others who couldn't, who died silent, who disappeared into unmarked graves. But Esther didn't die silent. For the next 3 weeks, from September 1st to September 23rd, Esther planned the most surgical act of revenge in Mississippi history. The first decision was the most important: how to execute justice while maximizing suffering and minimizing risk. Esther was not interested in quick deaths. Quick was too merciful. These men had stolen 14 years of her bodily autonomy, had murdered her daughter, had destroyed countless other lives. Quick was an insult to Grace's memory. Esther wanted them to suffer. She wanted them to feel violated. She wanted them to understand in their bodies what they had done to hers, to Grace's, to hundreds of enslaved women and girls. And then she realized she had the perfect method, the perfect irony, the perfect surgical revenge. These men had used their genitals as weapons for years. Esther would disarm them permanently. Castration, using the same surgical skills that had saved 43 white lives. She would mutilate 4 white men, using the same instruments that white women trusted to deliver their babies safely. She would deliver justice. The poetry was perfect. The message would be unmistakable. But execution required meticulous planning. 4 men, 4 separate locations, all in one night, with precision timing, with surgical accuracy, with no mistakes. Esther had 3 weeks. She used every minute. Step 1: study the targets. Colonel Augustus Thornhill, 63 years old, was a creature of rigid habits. He woke at 6:00 a.m., rode his plantation boundaries until 8:00, took breakfast, spent mornings in his office managing accounts. After lunch, he napped from 1:00 to 3:00, deeply aided by Bourbon. Always alone in his ground floor study while Constance rested upstairs. The study had a door that locked from the inside, which Thornhill used for privacy. But Esther had cleaned that room 100 times as a house slave before her midwifery status elevated her. She knew that the window facing the rose garden never locked properly, that the hinges were oiled weakly, that it opened silently. She had a 2-hour window. She needed only 30 minutes. Edmund Thornhill, 36 years old, was less predictable but more vulnerable due to his drinking. Every night, Edmund drank himself unconscious in his second-floor bedroom. He usually passed out between 10:00 and 11:00, stupefied by Bourbon and laudanum. He slept through anything. Cannon fire wouldn't wake him. His room was at the end of the hall, away from his parents' chamber. The house slaves joked that Edmund could be robbed blind and never know. Esther wouldn't rob him. She would take something far more valuable. Samuel McKinney, the overseer, 41 years old, lived alone in a small house between the big house and the slave quarters. He was a light sleeper, a violent man, strong. But he had a weakness. Every Saturday night, he visited a widow woman in the next county, returning around 2:00 a.m. drunk and tired. His horse knew the way home, even when McKinney was barely conscious. He would stable the horse himself, refusing help, then stumble to his house and collapse on his bed without removing his boots. Esther had watched this pattern for 13 years. Saturday nights, McKinney was helpless. Dr. Silas Peaton, 57 years old, was the most dangerous target because he was the most sober and alert. He lived in a small cottage near the medical cabin, near Esther's workspace. He kept odd hours, often awake until 3:00 or 4:00 a.m., reading medical journals, drinking coffee, occasionally performing late night examinations of enslaved women under the guise of medical necessity. But Peaton had one absolute routine. Every morning at 5:30, he took a 30-minute walk to the creek to collect water for his morning ablutions. He claimed the walk invigorated him. He was always alone, always unarmed, always vulnerable in the pre-dawn darkness. 4 men, 4 windows of vulnerability. 1 night to execute justice. Esther chose Saturday, September 23rd. McKinney would return drunk at 200 a.m. Peaton would walk to the creek at 5:30 a.m. In between, she could handle Thornhill and Edmund. But method was only half the plan. She also needed the right pharmaceutical assistance. Step 2. Prepare the drugs. Esther had access to the entire plantation's medical supplies, plus her own collected herbs. Over 3 weeks, she prepared a cocktail of substances that would make her work possible. For Thornhill, Edmund, and McKinney, a powerful paralytic derived from Jimson weed combined with a muscle relaxant from pokeweed roots. The mixture would paralyze voluntary movement, while leaving the victim fully conscious and able to feel everything. Esther had tested the dosage on 3 rats, achieving a perfect paralysis, lasting approximately 45 minutes with full sensory awareness maintained. The beauty of the paralytic was that victims could feel pain, could think, could understand what was happening, but couldn't scream, couldn't fight, couldn't resist. They would be trapped in their own bodies, experiencing violation with complete awareness and absolute helplessness. Exactly what Grace had experienced. Exactly what Esther had experienced for 14 years. Perfect symmetry. For administering the paralytic, Esther prepared 4 identical syringes, each filled with precise dosage calculated by body weight. She had access to morphine syringes from her medical supplies. No one would question a midwife possessing syringes. She also prepared smelling salts to ensure her victims stayed conscious throughout the procedure, and a topical numbing agent to apply to her own hands to prevent accidental bloodborne transmission of any infection during her work. Step 3. Prepare the instruments. Esther's medical kit contained everything she needed. Surgical scalpels, freshly sharpened. Forceps for grasping and holding tissue. Surgical scissors for cutting. Needle and catgut thread for suturing wounds closed after the operation. And a small bone saw, primarily used for difficult births where pelvic bones needed modification. She wouldn't need the bone saw for this, just the scalpels, forceps, and scissors. 3 weeks before the act, Esther began sterilizing her instruments, daily in boiling water, sharpening the blades to perfection. She practiced the surgical procedure on animal carcasses obtained from the plantation butcher. Sheep, pigs, goats. She performed the operation 17 times, until her movements were muscle memory, until she could complete the full procedure in under 4 minutes with her eyes closed. Human anatomy would be slightly different, but the principles were identical. Cut, clamp, remove, cauterize. Suture, clean, efficient, surgical. She packed her instruments in a leather roll, the same one she carried to every birth. No one would question the midwife carrying her medical bag. Step 4. Create alibis and contingencies. Esther understood that she would be the first suspect. An enslaved woman, a midwife with access and knowledge. The mother of a recently murdered child. The connection was obvious. But she also understood something about white Mississippi society in 1859. They could not conceive that a Negro woman was intelligent enough to plan and execute such an act. Their racism would be her camouflage. Still, she needed alibis for each act. For Colonel Thornhill, she would discover him at 3:30 p.m. during her scheduled check of the medical supplies in the big house. Her presence there was routine. For Edmund, she would be checking on the mistress, who had complained of headaches that afternoon. House slaves could confirm Esther had been asked to prepare a headache remedy. For McKinney, she would be walking to the creek for medicinal water. When she found him, enslaved people fetching water at odd hours was completely normal. For Dr. Peaton, she would be meeting him for their scheduled early morning consultation about a pregnant slave woman's condition. They had such meetings regularly. Every alibi was plausible. Every alibi placed her near the scene for legitimate reasons. Step 5. The escape plan. Esther had no illusions. Even with perfect execution, even with alibis, suspicion would fall on her eventually. The pattern was too obvious. 4 men, all connected to one enslaved woman, all mutilated in one night. She needed to disappear. For 3 weeks, Esther secretly gathered supplies, dried food that wouldn't spoil, a warm blanket, a knife, matches, and a small amount of money saved over years, $347. She sewed these items into a hidden pocket in her dress. She also made contact through the underground network that existed among enslaved people with the Underground Railroad. A station was located 47 miles north in Jackson, in the basement of a freed blacksmith named Abraham Porter. The password was Grace's Justice. Esther memorized the route. Follow the creek north until it met the Pearl River. Follow the Pearl River northeast to Jackson. Ask for Abraham Porter at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. If she could reach Abraham Porter, she could reach the north. She could reach freedom. But first, she had to deliver justice. On September 22nd, the night before the act, Esther couldn't sleep. She lay on her small cot in the cabin she had shared with Samuel and Grace. Grace's blanket still smelled like her. Samuel was at the big house, required to sleep near the stables during picking season. Esther held Grace's blanket and allowed herself one moment of pure grief. She cried silently, her body shaking, her heart breaking again and again with each breath. She whispered Grace's name. She whispered prayers in Yoruba that her grandmother had taught her. Prayers for the dead, prayers for justice, prayers for strength. Then she stood up, washed her face, and packed her medical bag with surgical precision. At midnight, she walked to the small plot behind the quarters where Grace was buried. The grave was marked with a wooden cross Samuel had carved. Esther knelt beside it. "Baby girl," she whispered. "Mama is going to make this right. They think they can take everything from us, and we'll just accept it. They're wrong. Tomorrow they'll understand what happens when they push too far. Tomorrow they'll understand that enslaved doesn't mean helpless." She placed her hand on the earth above Grace's body. "This is for you. All of it, for you." Then Esther stood, walked back to her cabin, and prepared for the most surgical night of her life. Saturday, September 23, 1859. Dawned clear and hot. Typical Mississippi September weather. The temperature would reach 94 degrees by afternoon. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of cotton, ready for picking. Esther went through her normal routine with perfect calm. She attended a pregnant woman in the quarters, checked on a child with fever, prepared herbal remedies. To everyone who saw her, she appeared normal, perhaps a bit quiet, but that was expected. Grace had been dead for only 3 weeks. No one suspected that inside her medical bag, along with the herbs and bandages, were 4 syringes filled with paralytic poison and surgical instruments sharpened to perfection. At 100 in the afternoon, Colonel Thornhill retired to his study for his daily nap, as predictable as sunrise. Esther waited 30 minutes, ensuring he was deeply asleep. Then she walked calmly to the big house, entered through the kitchen entrance as she always did, nodded to the house slaves, and made her way to the study window facing the rose garden. The window opened silently, just as she knew it would. Colonel Augustus Thornhill was asleep in his leather chair, head back, mouth open, snoring. He wore his usual afternoon attire: white linen shirt, brown trousers, suspenders. His hands were folded across his substantial belly. Those hands had touched Esther without permission more than 160 times over 14 years. She stood in the window, watching him sleep, and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no hesitation. No mercy. She stepped silently into the room, closing the window behind her. She removed a syringe from her medical bag, approached Thornhill from behind, and, with the professional precision of someone who had administered hundreds of injections, she inserted the needle into his neck and depressed the plunger. Thornhill's eyes flew open. He tried to move, to shout, but the paralytic was already working. Within 30 seconds, his body was completely immobilized. Only his eyes could move, and they moved frantically, finding Esther's face, recognizing her, filling with confusion, and then fear. Perfect. Esther walked around the chair to face him directly. She wanted him to see her clearly. She wanted him to understand who was about to unmake him. "Colonel Thornhill," she said quietly, her voice steady and cold. "You're wondering what's happening. Let me explain. I've just administered a paralytic agent derived from Jimson weed and pokeweed. You cannot move. You cannot speak. But you can feel everything. And you will." His eyes widened further, understanding beginning to dawn. 14 years. Esther continued, her voice still eerily calm. 14 years you violated me. You and your son and McKinney and Dr. Peaton. You thought you could use my body however you wanted because I'm your property. You thought there would be no consequences. She set her medical bag on his desk and began removing instruments. Scalpel, forceps, scissors, thread. 3 weeks ago, your son raped and murdered my 7-year-old daughter, Grace. Her name was Grace. You didn't know that, did you? You never asked. She was just another pickaninny to you. Thornhill's eyes were bulging now, sweat breaking out on his frozen face. He knew what was coming. Tonight I'm going to take from you what you took from me. Your ability to violate. Your manhood. Your future generations. Esther moved with surgical efficiency. She unbuttoned Thornhill's trousers, exposing him. She took the smelling salts from her bag and waved them under his nose, ensuring he was fully conscious and alert. Then she began. The scalpel cut with razor precision. Esther had performed this procedure 17 times on animal carcasses. Her hands were steady, her movements practiced and sure. She made the first incision, and Thornhill's paralyzed body couldn't scream, but his eyes screamed, bulging with agony and horror. You're feeling that, aren't you? Esther asked clinically. That's pain. That's violation. That's helplessness. That's what Grace felt. That's what I felt 160 times. She worked methodically. Cut. Clamp. Cut again. The forceps grasped. The scissors severed. 3 minutes and 47 seconds from first incision to complete removal. Thornhill's eyes rolled back in his head. Esther administered smelling salts again, forcing him back to consciousness. No passing out, she said. You stay here. You feel all of it. She held up the severed tissue in her forceps, showing him what she had taken. This is what you used as a weapon for 63 years. It's nothing now. Just meat. Just garbage. She dropped it on the floor and began the final step, cauterization, with a heated surgical iron to prevent fatal bleeding and suturing the wound closed. She didn't want him to die. Not yet. She wanted him to live with this. She wanted him to wake up tomorrow and remember. She wanted him to be unable to perform the act that had defined his power over women for his entire adult life. The cauterization took 90 seconds. The smell of burning flesh filled the study. Thornhill's eyes were wide with agony, tears streaming down his paralyzed face. Esther sutured the wound with careful, tight stitches. When she finished, she cleaned her instruments with the thoroughness of a professional, packed them back in her medical bag, and stood looking down at Colonel Thornhill. The paralytic will wear off in about 30 minutes, she said. You'll be able to move again. You'll be able to scream. By then, I'll be long gone from this room. You can tell people what happened, or you can lie. But either way, You'll never rape another woman. You'll never father another child. You'll never use your body as a weapon again. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, Grace says hello from hell. She's waiting for you there. Then Esther walked calmly to the window, climbed out, closed it behind her, and disappeared into the rose garden. Time elapsed, 17 minutes. 3 targets remaining. Esther returned to her cabin, washed her instruments thoroughly in boiling water, and waited. At 1800 that evening, right on schedule, a house slave came to her door with a message from Mistress Constance. She had a headache and wanted Esther to prepare a remedy. Perfect. Esther prepared a chamomile and lavender tea, placed it on a silver tray, and walked to the big house. Constance was in her sitting room complaining about the heat. Esther served the tea, listened to Constance's litany of minor ailments, and then mentioned casually, Mistress, while I'm here, I should check my medical supplies in the house. I'm running low on birthing linens. Fine. Constance waved her away dismissively. Esther climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hall was empty. Most house slaves were preparing dinner. Edmund's room was at the end of the hall, door closed. Esther knocked softly, no answer. She opened the door. Edmund Thornhill was passed out on his bed, fully clothed, reeking of bourbon and sweat. A half-empty bottle sat on the nightstand. He was snoring heavily, dead to the world. Esther closed and locked the door behind her. Edmund was sprawled on his back, arms flung wide, mouth open. He had raped and killed a 7-year-old child, and then drunk himself to sleep without a moment of guilt or fear of consequences. That was about to change. Esther approached the bed, removed the 2nd syringe from her medical bag, and injected the paralytic into Edmund's neck. His eyes opened slowly, confused and blurry. He saw Esther standing over him and tried to speak, but his tongue was already paralyzed. He tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't respond. Panic flooded his eyes. Hello, Edmund, Esther said softly. Remember me? I'm the mother of the child you murdered 3 weeks ago. Recognition and fear washed over his face. You raped and killed Grace. She was 7 years old. She was my daughter, my only child. Esther set her medical bag on the bed and began removing instruments again. Scalpel, forceps, scissors, thread. I did this to your father about 6 hours ago, she said conversationally. He's downstairs right now, probably in agony, probably trying to decide whether to admit what happened or invent some accident. Either way, he's no longer a man in the way he understands manhood. She unbuttoned Edmund's trousers. Now it's your turn. Edmund's eyes were wild with terror, darting around the room, looking for escape, for help, finding nothing. The paralytic held him completely immobile. Grace was screaming when you hurt her, Esther said, her voice steady. The slaves in the next cabin heard her, but no one came to help because we're not allowed to interfere with white people's business. She screamed for 2 hours, Edmund. 2 hours. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine hurting a child for 2 hours? She made the first cut. Edmund's eyes bulged impossibly wide. His body tried to convulse in agony, but the paralytic held him rigid. Only his eyes and the veins in his neck revealed the intensity of his pain. You're a 36-year-old man, and you raped a 7-year-old girl, Esther continued, working with surgical precision. What kind of monster does that? What kind of creature? Cut, clamp, sever. Her movements were even faster this time, muscle memory taking over. 3 minutes and 12 seconds from first incision to complete castration. She held up the severed tissue. This is what you used to murder my baby. Look at it. Nothing. Just meat. Just garbage. She dropped it on the floor next to the bed, then cauterized and sutured the wound with the same professional care she'd given his father. When she finished, she leaned close to Edmund's paralyzed face. Tears were streaming from his eyes, running into his hair. "You'll live," she whispered. "You'll wake up tomorrow with this wound healing. You'll have to explain it somehow. You'll have to live the rest of your life knowing a Negro woman did this to you, and you couldn't stop her. You'll have to live knowing that Grace had her justice, that her mama made sure you could never hurt another child." She wiped her instruments clean, packed her bag, unlocked the door, and walked calmly down the stairs. In the sitting room, Constance asked, "Did you find your supplies?" "Les, mistress," Esther replied. "Everything I needed. Time elapsed 14 minutes. 2 targets remaining." Esther returned to her cabin and waited. At midnight, she lay down on her cot, fully dressed, medical bag packed beside her. She didn't sleep. She watched the darkness through her window, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal Samuel McKinney's return from his Saturday night visit to the widow woman in the next county. At 1:53 in the morning, she heard the horse. Esther rose, took her medical bag, and walked silently through the darkness toward McKinney's house. She positioned herself behind the stables where she could watch without being seen. McKinney was swaying in the saddle, barely conscious. He dismounted clumsily, nearly fell, caught himself on the stable door. He led his horse inside, spent several minutes unsaddling the animal with fumbling, drunk movements, then stumbled toward his house. Esther followed at a distance. McKinney's house was small, 2 rooms, built for function, not comfort. He pushed the door open, didn't bother lighting a lamp, just stumbled to his bedroom and collapsed face down on the bed without removing his boots. Within minutes, he was snoring. Esther waited 10 minutes to ensure he was deeply unconscious, then silently opened his unlocked door and entered. McKinney's bedroom smelled of sweat, whiskey, and unwashed clothes. He was sprawled on his stomach, face turned to the side, arms hanging off the bed. This was the man who had whipped enslaved people for sport, who had raped dozens of women, who had sold children away from their mothers for profit, who had beaten an elderly man to death for moving too slowly, who had personally inflicted more suffering than Esther could calculate. She felt no mercy. She rolled McKinney onto his back. He was so drunk he barely stirred. She administered the paralytic injection to his neck. His eyes opened slowly, bloodshot and confused. He saw Esther standing over him and tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't respond. Confusion turned to alarm. "Hello, Mr. McKinney," Esther said coldly. "You're wondering why you can't move. I've paralyzed you. You're completely helpless right now. Helpless like all the people you've hurt over the years." Understanding and fear flooded his eyes. "I'm Esther. You've raped me 17 times over the past 13 years. You whipped my husband Samuel for speaking back to you. You sold 3 women from my cabin to a breeding farm last year." She set her medical bag on the small table beside his bed and removed her instruments. "Tonight I castrated Kunal Thornhill and his son Edmund. Now it's your turn." McKinney's eyes went wide with terror. He tried desperately to move, to fight, but the paralytic held him completely immobilized. Esther unbuttoned his trousers. "You used violence and rape to feel powerful your whole life because you're poor white trash, and that's the only power you had. Hurting people weaker than you, especially black people, especially black women." First incision. McKinney's body tried to convulse in agony. The paralytic prevented movement but couldn't prevent pain. His eyes rolled back, veins bulging in his neck and forehead. "How does it feel?" Esther asked calmly, continuing her surgical work. "To be completely helpless while someone cuts into you. To feel pain and not be able to fight or scream or escape. Clamp. Sever." 2 minutes and 58 seconds this time. She was getting faster. "This is what every woman you raped felt," Esther said, holding up the severed tissue. helpless, violated, powerless. She dropped it on the floor and began cauterization. The smell of burning flesh filled the small bedroom. McKinn's paralyzed face was a mask of agony. Sweat pouring, tears streaming, silent screaming visible in every muscle. Esther sutured the wound with careful precision, then cleaned her instruments and repacked her bag. "You'll live," she told him. "The paralytic will wear off in about 20 minutes. You'll be able to move again. You'll be able to scream. But you'll never hurt another woman, never father a child, never feel like a man again." She leaned close to his ear. "Grace was 7 years old when Edmund Thornhill raped and killed her. You heard her screaming from your house and you did nothing. You could have stopped it. You didn't. So this is for all of us. All the women, all the children, all the people you hurt." Esther walked out of McKinn's house into the pre-dawn darkness. Time elapsed 11 minutes. One target remaining. Dr. Silas Peaton. Esther had 3 hours before Peaton would take his morning walk to the creek. She returned to her cabin, washed her instruments again with boiling water, and prepared for the final act. At 500 in the morning, the plantation was still dark and quiet. Dawn wouldn't break for another 45 minutes. Esther positioned herself along the path to the creek, hidden in the brush, medical bag at her feet. At 5:27, Dr. Peaton emerged from his cottage carrying a bucket, walking briskly toward the creek. He was whistling softly, completely unaware. Esther stepped out onto the path directly in front of him. Peaton jumped, startled. "Esther. Good Lord, girl, you nearly gave me a heart attack. What are you doing out here at this hour?" "Good morning, Dr. Peaton," Esther said calmly. "I need to speak with you about a medical matter. A pregnant woman in the quarters. Unusual symptoms. This was normal. They had such consultations regularly. Can it wait until after breakfast?" Peaton asked, annoyed at the interruption to his routine. "I'm afraid not. She's in considerable distress." Peaton sighed. "Very well. Let me fetch my medical bag from my cottage and—" "I have everything we need right here," Esther said, holding up her own medical bag. "If you'll just step off the path, I can show you my notes." Peaton followed her a few feet into the woods, away from the path, to a small clearing. "Now, what seems to be the—" Esther injected the paralytic into his neck before he finished the sentence. Peaton's eyes widened in shock. He tried to speak, to move, but his body was already shutting down. He collapsed backward, unable to control his fall, landing hard on the ground. Esther stood over him, looking down without emotion. "Dr. Peaton," she said quietly, "you're a physician. You took an oath to do no harm. And yet you've hurt so many people. Medical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia. Raping women under the guise of examinations. Dissecting live tissue because you knew nobody would stop you." Peaton's eyes were wide with fear and understanding. "I trusted you," Esther continued. "You were a doctor. You were supposed to help people. But you raped me 11 times over 13 years. You told me it was medical necessity. You said I should be grateful you were gentle." She knelt beside his paralyzed body and began removing her instruments. "I castrated 3 men tonight," she said conversationally. "Colonel Thornhill, Edmund, and McKinney. You're the last one, the final piece of justice." Peaton tried desperately to move, to speak, to do anything. Nothing worked. Esther unbuttoned his trousers. "You're a doctor, so you understand exactly what I'm about to do. You understand the anatomy, the nerve structures, the pain receptors. You know precisely how much this is going to hurt. First incision." Peaton's eyes bulged impossibly wide. His medical knowledge made it worse. He knew exactly what was being cut, exactly what was being severed, exactly what he was losing. "This is surgical revenge," Esther said, working with practiced efficiency. The same precision you used in your medical experiments. The same care you took when you hurt people for your own curiosity. Clat, clamp, sever. 2 minutes and 41 seconds. Her fastest yet. She held up the severed tissue. You won't be performing any more medical examinations on enslaved women, Dr. Peaton. You won't be experimenting. You won't be using your medical authority to commit rape. She dropped it beside his paralyzed body and began cauterization and suturing. When she finished, she cleaned her instruments one final time and packed her medical bag. The paralytic will wear off soon, she told him. You'll be able to crawl back to your cottage. You'll survive this physically. But professionally, personally, you're finished. You're mutilated, unmanned, destroyed. She stood up, looking down at the paralyzed physician with cold satisfaction. Grace was my daughter, 7 years old. Edmund Thornhill raped and killed her. You could have stopped it. You examined her broken body afterward and declared it unfortunate. No investigation, no justice, just unfortunate. The Esther leaned close to Peaton's face. This is justice, doctor. Real justice. The kind that comes when the law fails. When society fails. When every system designed to protect the innocent fails. She straightened up, took one last look at the 4 severed pieces of tissue, trophies of her surgical revenge, and walked away. Time elapsed 9 minutes. Mission complete. By the time Esther returned to her cabin, dawn was breaking over Thornhill Plantation. The sky was turning pink and gold. Birds were singing. The world looked peaceful and beautiful. Inside that beautiful morning, 4 white men were waking up to a nightmare. Esther washed her surgical instruments one final time, packed them carefully in her medical bag, along with the few possessions she would take with her. She changed into her traveling dress with the hidden pockets containing food, money, and supplies. She walked one last time to Grace's grave. It's done, baby girl, she whispered, kneeling beside the small wooden cross. Justice is done. They can't hurt anyone else now. They'll live, but they'll live broken. They'll live knowing a Negro woman destroyed them, and they couldn't stop her. Esther placed her hand on the earth covering her daughter. Mama has to go now. I can't stay here. They'll figure out it was me and they'll kill me. But I'm not afraid. I got justice for you. That's all that matters. She stood, took one last look at the cabin she had shared with Samuel and Grace, and walked north. The first person to discover the carnage was a house slave named Martha, who brought Colonel Thornhill his morning coffee at 700. She found him in his study, conscious now, curled in a ball on the floor, moaning in agony. The room smelled of blood and burned flesh. Martha screamed. Within minutes, the big house erupted in chaos. Constance came running, saw her husband's condition, and fainted. Other slaves were summoned. Someone ran for Dr. Peaton. But Peaton wasn't in his cottage. They found him an hour later crawling back from the creek, leaving a trail of blood, mutilated and broken. Edmund was discovered in his bedroom by a slave sent to wake him, in the same condition as his father. By 800 in the morning, when a slave went to fetch the overseer McKinney, they found him as well. Conscious now, screaming obscenities and death threats, but unmanned and helpless. 4 white men, all castrated, all mutilated, all on the same night. The horror and panic that swept through Thornhill Plantation, and then through all of Covington County, and then through the entire state of Mississippi, was unlike anything seen before. This wasn't a slave rebellion where dozens of enslaved people rose up with weapons. This wasn't a fire or a poisoning or a mass escape. This was surgical, precise, personal, terrifying, and everyone knew immediately who had done it.
Find Esther!
Colonel Thornhill roared from his bed where he lay in agony.
Find that bitch!
Find her and bring her to me. But Esther was already 40 miles away, following the creek north toward Jackson and the Underground Railroad station, moving fast and silent through the Mississippi woods. The plantation erupted into a frenzy. The slave quarters were searched. Every enslaved person was interrogated. Samuel, Esther's husband, was beaten and questioned for hours. "I don't know where she is," Samuel said truthfully. Esther had told him nothing to protect him. "She left before dawn. I don't know where she went." They searched the woods, the fields, the neighboring plantations. They organized hunting parties with bloodhounds. They posted rewards, $1,000 for Esther's capture, dead or alive. But Esther had a 12-hour head start, and she knew how to move unseen. She traveled through the day, following the creek, avoiding roads, moving with the steady determination of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. By nightfall on September 24th, Esther reached the outskirts of Jackson. She found the African Methodist Episcopal Church, asked for Abraham Porter, and gave the password, "Grace's Justice." Abraham Porter, a freed blacksmith in his 50s, looked at this small woman with the medical bag and saw immediately what she was: a fugitive, a fighter, a survivor. "You're the one," he said quietly. "We heard. Word travels fast. 4 white men castrated in one night at Thornhill Plantation. Every slave patrol in Mississippi is looking for you." "I know," Esther said. "Can you help me?" Abraham studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Sister, it would be my honor." That night, Esther descended into the basement of Abraham Porter's house and joined the Underground Railroad. Within a week, she was in Tennessee. Within a month, she was in Kentucky. By December, she crossed into Ohio and freedom. She was never captured. She was never found. Back in Mississippi, the aftermath of Esther's surgical revenge reverberated for years. Colonel Thornhill survived his injuries, but was never the same. The physical wound healed, but the psychological damage was permanent. He became paranoid, suspicious of every enslaved person on his plantation. He sold half his slaves within a year, fearing another attack. He died in 1862, a broken, fearful man. Edmund Thornhill descended into alcoholism and died of liver failure in 1864, age 39. Samuel McKinney left Mississippi and was never heard from again. Rumors said he became a hermit, unable to face society after being unmanned by a Negro woman. Dr. Silas Peaton's medical career ended the day Esther castrated him. No patient would see him. No hospital would employ him. He returned to Philadelphia in disgrace and drank himself to death within 2 years. But the real impact was broader and deeper. Esther's act terrified slave owners across the South. If one enslaved woman could plan and execute such precise revenge, what else were enslaved people capable of? The myth of the passive, childlike Negro was shattered. Insurance rates for slave owners increased. Security measures intensified. Paranoia spread, and among enslaved people, Esther's story became legend. The story spread through the underground networks, through spirituals, through whispered conversations in the quarters. A woman named Esther who castrated 4 white men and disappeared like smoke. A mother who avenged her daughter. A healer who used her skills to deliver justice instead of babies. The details changed as the story traveled. In some versions, she killed 10 men. In others, she burned down the entire plantation. In others, she led a slave rebellion. But the core truth remained: an enslaved woman had fought back with intelligence, skill, and surgical precision, and had escaped to freedom. Her story inspired others. In the years following 1859, there were 17 documented cases of enslaved people using medical knowledge to resist their oppressors across the Deep South. Poisonings, surgical mutilations, mysterious deaths of cruel masters. The Thornhill Plantation effect, some historians would later call it, though they rarely mentioned Esther by name. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, An elderly black woman appeared in Mississippi claiming to be Esther. She was 67 years old, had lived in Ohio for 26 years, and came back to reclaim her story. She visited Grace's grave, placed flowers, and whispered prayers in Yoruba. When asked if she regretted what she'd done, she said simply, "I regret that I couldn't do more. I regret that I could only stop 4 monsters when there were thousands. But I don't regret giving my daughter justice. I don't regret showing enslaved people that we were not helpless. I don't regret proving that intelligence and skill are weapons more powerful than whips and chains." Esther died in 1879 in Cleveland, Ohio, at age 74. Surrounded by the community of freed slaves, she had helped through the Underground Railroad. She trained 14 midwives in her lifetime after gaining freedom, passing on her Yoruba medical knowledge to a new generation. She never remarried. She never had another child. Grace was her only baby, and avenging Grace was her life's defining act. On her tombstone, carved by her own instructions, are the words, Esther, healer, mother, free. What can we learn from Esther's story today, over 160 years later? First, that intelligence and knowledge are the most powerful weapons against oppression. Esther didn't need guns or armies. She used the skills her grandmother taught her. The medical training she'd gained through years of saving white lives, and turned that knowledge into justice. Second, that oppression always has limits. Push people too far, take too much, hurt too deeply, and eventually they push back. Slave owners believed they could do anything to enslaved people without consequences. Esther proved them wrong. Third, that resistance takes many forms. Not every act of rebellion is a public uprising. Sometimes resistance is quiet, methodical, surgical. Sometimes one person acting with precision can change everything. Fourth, that the official history books lie by omission. Esther's story was erased from most historical records because it was too terrifying for white historians to acknowledge. But the story survived anyway, preserved in oral traditions, in spirituals, in the memories of black communities who understood its importance. And finally, that trauma demands acknowledgement and justice. Esther lost 14 years of bodily autonomy and her only child. The legal system offered her no recourse. Society offered her no protection, so she created her own justice. We can debate whether her methods were right or wrong, but we cannot debate whether her pain was real. The scars of slavery persist in America today. Mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black Americans. Police violence continues. Economic inequality follows the same geographic patterns as slavery. The trauma is generational, passed down through DNA and social structures. Esther's story reminds us that this trauma has always demanded resistance. That Black Americans have never been passive victims, but active fighters for dignity and justice. That resistance has taken countless forms, some celebrated in history books, some erased, but all part of the ongoing struggle. When you hear about modern movements for racial justice, remember that they're continuing work that Esther started. When you hear about Black women fighting for bodily autonomy, remember that Esther fought the same fight centuries ago. When you hear about the need for systemic change, remember that Esther proved individuals can shake systems to their foundations. Esther's surgical revenge was brutal. Yes, it was violent. It was irreversible. But it was also a mother's love transformed into action. It was intelligence weaponized against oppression. It was proof that enslaved didn't mean helpless. That property could think and plan, and execute justice with devastating precision. The 4 white men Esther castrated in September 1859 lived the rest of their lives as warnings. Warnings to other slave owners: push too far and someone will push back. Warnings to history: oppression always generates resistance. Warnings to us today: The fight for justice never ends. It just changes forms. Say her name. Esther. Born Eshura in Yorubaland. Enslaved at age 15. Midwife. Healer. Mother survivor. Avenger. Free. Remember Grace. 7 years old. Whose death sparked one of the most surgically precise acts of revenge in American history. Remember that behind every statistic about slavery are individual human beings with names, stories, pain, love, and rage. Remember that resistance is as American as oppression. That every act of injustice plants seeds of future rebellion. That systems built on cruelty eventually face people like Esther who refuse to accept that cruelty as permanent. And remember that the fight continues. Different battlefield, same war. The struggle for dignity, for justice, for the radical idea that all human beings deserve to live free from violation and fear. That struggle didn't end in 1865 when slavery was abolished. It continues today, and it will continue until the deep roots of that original sin are finally pulled from American soil. Esther pulled 4 roots in one night. We honor her memory by continuing to pull more, until the soil is finally clean and something new can grow. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think, share it. Comment below, was Esther's revenge justice or murder? What would you have done in her place? How do we honor stories like this while building a better future? Subscribe for more untold stories from American history. Stories they didn't teach you in school. Stories that reveal the complexity, the brutality, and the resistance that built this country. And most importantly, remember their names. Remember their stories. Because that's how we prevent history from repeating. That's how we honor the dead. That's how we finish what Esther started. Grace's justice was served on September 23, 1859. The fight for justice continues today. Never stop fighting. Never accept oppression. Never forget those who fought before us.